Hi guys, it is day 2 of the Barcelona lockdown and I actually hope you're all doing well. To make your day a bit more enjoyable, we are going to present you the case of Repsol, a Spanish oil company which acquired the Argentinian oil company YPF in its international expansion strategy to Argentina. But before we dive into the case, we are Team 7 consisting of Maxime, Shadow, Hendrik, Isabel and myself. This brings us to the agenda for today. First, we will describe the case by mapping out the situation in Argentina and introducing the companies in question, Repsol and YPF. Afterwards, we will define how the situation in Argentina evolved and how this eventually resulted in the nationalization of YPF. Furthermore, we will analyze how Repsol responded through the nationalization and provide our takes on the case as well as the corresponding managerial implications. In the end, we will wrap it up with a live Q&A in which you actually have the opportunity to discuss some of the key aspects of the case. The country central in today's case, as already mentioned, is Argentina. Therefore, it's super important to get a better understanding of the basics of the country's political and economic history. Throughout the 20th century, Argentina experienced political instability under a series of leaders, ranging from elected populists to military dictators. As a matter of fact, between 1930 and 1983, presidents averaged 2 years in office, which is severely low and therefore displays the political uncertainty in the country. During this period, a series of political events resulted in numerous economic crises in Argentina. The government's reforms scared off many private investors, and this had major impacts on the oil companies. However, in 1989, a new president set the country in a course of radical free market reforms, resulting in a period of comparative stability and economic growth. Yet the growth did not last, because in 2001 the instability returned, with widespread hunger resulting in riots, during which Argentina had 5 presidents in just 2 weeks. At the same time, the government defaulted nearly $1 billion in debt, which was the largest default in history. But for now, we got a better understanding of the situation in Argentina, and it's super important to also get a better understanding of the two companies in play, starting with Repsol, which was founded by the Spanish government in 1987, and until 1996 the company's holdings remained limited to Spain. They had an ownership of 5 refineries, a chain of gas stations, and a 91% equity stake in a national gas distributor. But in 1997 things started to change because the company was privatized. They started their downstream expansion by buying gas stations in Ecuador, Peru and Argentina, as well as their upstream international expansion through the acquisition of a 60% equity stake in Plus Petro Energy, which actually holds the largest natural gas field in Argentina at that time. In 1997, Repsol fully acquired YPF through 2 share purchases. And one thing that's important to point out here is that 1999 was when Argentina was in a period of comparative stability compared to its past. So the economic situation wasn't that bad as before. But let's get a bit closer into YPF. YPF was founded in 1922 in Argentina and was actually the world's first state-owned oil company. But one thing that's important to mention here is that it was already partially privatized in 1993 through an IPO at the New York Stock Exchange. After the acquisition of YPF, Repsol became the 7th largest oil producer and reached an 8th place in oil and gas reserves.
Now that we have presented you some background information on Argentina, its oil industry and the companies involved, let's talk about the historic relationship between those. The pace of oil industry development has owed much more to politics than to geological discoveries historically. On the left, you can see the typical cycle of the relationship between oil companies and the Argentinian government. It usually starts with economic distress, and Argentina has seen a lot of those in the past century. That leads to oil companies having more power over the government due to the high tax returns that they bring, which means that the government start taking concessions to foreign capital that usually owns those oil companies. That naturally angers the public and leads to the populist politicians using the situation to come into power. And lastly, they take populistic, nationalistic measures that lead the country to the start of the cycle and new economic distress. YPF was especially affected by this government oil cycle, and you would see a prime example of this later on in our presentation. Let's talk about examples of more recent events in this cycle. Argentina had introduced price controls on oil and gas in 2002 in an effort to control inflation. That led to a reduction in oil production of 12% and unsatisfied demand in the market. It even led to some companies leaving the market. 8 years later, in 2010, in many ways because of that decision, Argentina began importing oil for the first time in 20 years. YPF's 42.5% drop in oil production between 1999 and 2011 was heavily criticized by the president, which brings us nicely to those in power during the events we will talk about. After a horrible period of the 80s for Argentina, when inflation surpassed 5,000% and political instability in the 90s, in 2003 Argentina in public elected a populist, nationalistic president, Nestor Kirchner. He was followed in 2007 by 2 terms by his wife, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who stayed in power till 2015. This period, often referred to as Kirchnerismo, was defined by concentration of power, populist social welfare programs, and a steady diet of Argentinian nationalism. It was preceded by more free market presidents, but Kirchner's reversed policies adopted by the predecessors. Kirchner's typical response to economic problems was nationalization to gain back popularity. For example, after inflation went into double digits, he nationalized Argentina's pension plan in 2008 and soon renationalized the airline Aerolíneas Argentinas. At around the same time, the story we were telling you about today unfolded. In 2007, the government was eager to Argentinize the oil industry to exercise higher control and thus increase oil production. In 2008, just as other nationalizations were taking place, President Nestor Kirchner forced Repsol to sell 15% of YPF shares to the Eskenazi family, which is part of Peterson Group, with an option for an additional 10%. The issue was that Eskenazi didn't take 1 peso out of their own pockets. Both purchases, 15% and 10%, were entirely debt-financed, with the debts to be repaid through dividends. As a part of the agreement sponsored by Nestor Kirchner, Repsol committed to have a dividend policy of paying out 90% of Repsol's profits. That is, the Eskenazi family didn't make any disbursement nor take any risks. In a sense, they got 25% of YPF for free given its political connections. Moreover, one member of this family became CEO of YPF. As you can see, Repsol was feeling a lot of pressure from the Argentine government 5 years before the expropriation. The shale oil and gas discovery in Vaca Muerta in 2011 changed the situation and increased the appetite for nationalizing YPF at a time of increasing economic difficulties. Moreover, Nestor Kirchner suddenly passed away in 2010. The economic ministers and advisors of President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner were a group of people with more populist and nationalist orientations than the ones under Nestor Kirchner. As a result, Repsol lost any fluent communication with the Argentine government that it had before. In early 2012, the first rumors of impeding nationalization were voiced through state-owned media, and in the middle of 2012, the government officially announced that it will expropriate YPF from Repsol. In 2014, the decision has been settled. Peterson Group still owned 25% of total shares, and 17% of shares belong to the free trade market. The majority part of the previous shares owned by Repsol, 51% out of 57.4%, was seized by the government and just 6.4% was left for Repsol. Now let's talk about the immediate aftermath of this. The expropriation of YPF deprived Repsol of about 60% of its global oil and natural gas production and half of its reserves. In 3 months after the announcement of expropriation, Repsol shares lost approximately 37% of their market value. As mentioned, Vaca Muerta was discovered with huge reserves in both shale gas and shale oil in 2011. The expropriation not only led to Repsol losing these huge potential resource reserves, but the initial investment was substantial, and after nationalization would be considered a sunk cost. Repsol's different shareholders pursued different interests such as long-term development of Repsol and short-term profits, which caused inevitable conflicts of interest among relevant parties.
Now that we understand the situation that Repsol is facing, let's take a look at the options they had to react. For one, they could write it off. This might initially look like a weak response, but sometimes it's better to cut your losses and move on to new projects. And in fact, Repsol has been doing this in the past, for example in Bolivia in 2006. Alternatively, Repsol can start a legal battle, either through lawsuits or arbitration. Here they have different avenues of attack. For example, YPF was listed in the New York Stock Exchange, where Repsol could claim for a breach in shareholders agreement. Alternatively, they could file a claim with the World Bank's International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. This is a very powerful arbitration court, but also very bureaucratic and takes a long time to resolve. Lastly, Repsol could take a more diplomatic approach. There are many stakeholders interested in the success of the company. For example, the Spanish government, the European Union, shareholders, or business partners. Getting them involved might help resolve the issue in the back channels. Now let's take a look at the measures that Repsol actually took. Reading the slide from the left to the right, we can see that Repsol took swift and aggressive action. They instantly filed with the ICSID, which, as I mentioned, takes a long time to kick off and an even longer time to resolve. So therefore, they filed 2 additional lawsuits in New York, citing that YPF broke shareholder agreements, which they originally signed in the initial public offering. As the development of the Vaca Muerta oil fields started, Repsol continued to be aggressive. They filed lawsuits against every single competitor, in total 9, which made deals with YPF. Most of those lawsuits would probably go nowhere, but the point was to slow down the development of the oil field and the usage of YPF. But all of this effort seemed to lead nowhere. Only more than a year after the start of the legal battle did the Argentinian government send an offer. Until that point, Repsol had never been able to be in the same room with a government representative to negotiate. They had been completely ignored by the Argentinian government. The offer was quickly and unanimously refused, even though Repsol was facing strong shareholder pressure. This is mainly because the majority of the repairment was locked into a minority joint venture with YPF, with the purpose of developing the Vaca Muerta oil field. Repsol would have little control over how this money is spent and gain barely any benefit from developing this oil field. This quickly led to a new offer of $5 billion in cash. They were transferred in government bonds, but were downside protected. So if fluctuations in currency would decrease the value of the bonds, they would issue more bonds and give more bonds to Repsol. Repsol quickly accepted this offer, and as soon as they received the bonds, sold all of them and their remaining shares in YPF, exited this situation and moved on.
Now we would like to take a closer look at Repsol's both market and non-market strategy. First, as for its market part, Repsol's decision to enter into the Argentinian market contributes to its upstream international expansion strategy in South America. Moreover, the country showed major growth and profitability opportunities, which aligns with Repsol's focus on making profits and serving shareholders' interests. We have identified a key strategic mistake related to the new oil and gas reserves discovered in this place. The announcement of this huge potential of this discovery shook up the market and contributed to the government expropriation decision. It could have been avoided by, for example, underplaying the size of the discovery in the press, but it was announced immediately due to the internal efforts to oust Repsol's CEO by shareholders. Second, when examining the non-market environment, it can be concluded that the company entered during a period of comparative stability. However, Argentina had a long history of different issues such as political instability or high debt. Under this situation, despite the flourishing period, there were warming signals that Repsol had to take into account. To get a better understanding of both political and economic climate, companies should analyze the macro environment and adjust the non-market strategy accordingly. Hence, considering the potential returns from YPF Repsol, especially after the discovery, the potential return on investment of lobbying could be really high. Repsol could have chosen one of the two strategies: either lobby its interests in the existing government or support the opposition of the highly nationalistic government. Besides, it came across mistakes of nationalization. In 2007, Repsol was essentially forced by selling 25% of its share to a domestic partner by the government. Instead, what they have announced about this new discovery only pushed the government to nationalize this company. To wrap it up, companies should always ensure the market and no-market strategy is integrated and aligned to achieve the best possible results. This requires intensive stakeholder management to ensure all needs are being satisfied. And now move on to the evaluations of the measurements after acquisition. So for us, we consider that the 5 billion cash settlements was received as a win. However, there are some drawbacks of this legal battle. The first drawback is the investment in the legal team, and the next one is probably the need to sell the promising liquefied gas division to the government. And also, company focus on this battle rather than its business development, and the 50% of the supply loss can be also considered as drawbacks as well. And after standing from the drawbacks, we also take the stakeholder analysis into consideration. For Repsol or YPF, it has the competition's relationship with the Argentine government, while it has a cooperation's relationship with the Spanish government. And also, the two largest stakeholders or shareholders of this company take the control of the decision making. And under this situation, we put forward 4 different alternatives of these after acquisition measurements. The first one is to analyze the Argentina, for example, like the history of the economic disaster, the need for or handling of the FDI, and so on. And the next one is try to gain support from Spanish government to earn more bargaining power to talk with the Argentine government. And the third one is try to figure out the conflict of interest among stakeholders and try to reconcile the contradictions to manage a better relationship. And the last one is the need to access the international capital markets. To summarize, EU members and US blocking access until YPF dispute was solved made Argentina look for a resolution.
To conclude, we would like to give you an insight in the lessons learned and material implications for M&Es. First of all, M&Es like Repsol are operating in an institutional context by cooperating and competing with host governments like Argentina and home governments like Spain in our case. This is important as business goals often require the collaboration of governments. However, this also means that M&Es are exposed to political risks, meaning the probability of disruption of operations through political forces. Generally speaking, political risks, as well as financial and economic risks, are part of the country risk. Political risk is thereby measured by the level of a country's stability. And it is furthermore essential to know that it is challenging to quantify political risks. Bremer recommends in this context to analyze the strength and stability of the government, the society, meaning if there are social tensions or factors like income gaps or rising unemployment, the country's security, so aspects like alliances or preparedness for natural disasters, and economic factors such as growth, investment, or debt levels. Finally, ownership risks like expropriation in our case, operational tantra risks, are hazards caused by political risks. Concluding, one can summarize that our case depicts a perfect example of the strong role of politics in international business, and it is essential to include non-market factors in our M&E's business. Finally, we would like to provide you with some specific strategies which M&Es could pursue in order to mitigate political risks. We therefore divided our recommendations in 4 aspects: to gather info, to proactively engage, to manage risk, and to strategize. So firstly, you should collect information on your stakeholders and their interests. You should inform yourself about the political environment from a long-term perspective and review how the government acted in past disputes with other M&Es to predict future behavior. Further, you should look at treaties, encouraging as well as protecting FDI in a specific country. And if you're investing in a state-owned firm or company of special national interest, such as energy, it would be recommendable to conduct a more profound investigation. Secondly, M&Es should actively build constructive working relationships with the governments to get support. This could, for instance, be done by lobbying. Furthermore, it is advisable to tie local interests with your firm through, for example, partnering with local companies. And thirdly, the managers of M&Es should attempt to mitigate risks by engaging in several countries and not only in one, as well as considering insurance against political risks. Such an insurance might, however, be expensive, as political risks are hard to assess. And lastly, it is essential to effectively strategize by developing a market as well as non-market strategy. The non-market environment is thereby characterized by the 4 I's. Issues, so what non-market strategies assess or address, institutions, as well as interests. So interests mean individuals or groups with a stake in the issue, and finally information. So to conclude, one can say that the long-term and dynamic analysis of political risk is crucial, but it's also very challenging and based on subjective interpretations. We are now at the end of our presentation. We'd like to thank you very much for your attention and switch back to our live online class in order to discuss some interesting questions together with you.